Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's returning guest is Kyle Anzalone, who is part of the Libertarian Institute. He runs his own show, the Kyle Anzalone Show, and also Conflicts of Interest. He's here today to talk about Gaza, the West Bank, and Syria if we have time. We're going to try and focus on kind of newer stories that you may have been hearing about, but might not have kind of the background or the updates to kind of now. So how are you doing today, Kyle?
Doing well. Happy to be back on the show, man.
Yeah, no, always good to have you on. Yeah, so if you could just start off actually um, with Gaza. So with this new aid group that's running things, because if we rewind, Israel basically kind of froze letting in any aid to Gaza. There was a lot of pressure from kind of European countries and their allies, whether they cared or not more, just, this is very bad optics. You need to let in aid. And there was kind of pressure mounting and a change of rhetoric from countries like the UK, France, and Germany. So then there's this new group that's been dealing with the aid, but there's been a lot of horror stories that have come out since then, a lot of suspicion around the group and who they are. So, first of all, can you just tell people what the name of that aid group is, kind of their basic history, and what's been going on since they've started handing out aid in specific areas of Gaza?
Yeah, so the organization you're talking about is the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or the GHF. And it's only been in existence, I believe, since February. And it originally had like both a Swiss and an American kind of outlet, but now just the American. I believe it was either the Swiss or Sweden or someone. There was some branch in Europe that was shut down. And so the funding for this organization is unknown. I actually, one of my colleagues at the Libertarian Institute tried to approach them about getting an answer on that, and we didn't have any response, unfortunately. We do know about $30 million of their funding is coming through the State Department, and there's been reports that the State Department was considering giving them 500 million. But I guess, to maybe kind of explain the timeline here and why this organization is important. On January 19th, before Trump came into office, but because of Trump's pressure, Israel and Hamas agreed to a ceasefire and hostage deal that was supposed to be carried out in three phases. And phase one would see, I believe, over half of the living hostages released, as well as the bodies of some of the other Israeli hostages held by Hamas and other militant groups in Gaza. And then phase two, that first phase would last 6 weeks. And then phase two would start, after a month and a half. And this phase would involve the release of the rest of the hostages and the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. And then phase three would be the rebuilding of Gaza. And so we get through I mean, it's shaky, but the phase one of the deal does happen. There is a more or less ceasefire in Gaza, although I believe over 100 Palestinians die from the January 19th until early March when the ceasefire is broken. A couple dozen Israeli hostages get out. Some Palestinian prisoners are released, although many of them are beaten before they're released. They're humiliated along with their families by the shirts that they're forced to wear and things like that. And more humanitarian aid, not the agreed amount of humanitarian aid, but more humanitarian aid enters Gaza during this 6 week period. Now, towards the end of the ceasefire, Israel starts to shut off aid entering Gaza. And on March 2nd, they close all aid from entering the strip. Well, there is a little bit of a stockpile because aid agencies are careful in how they distribute aid. And so over the next month or so, things are tight in Gaza, but they're holding together. And then in late May, really, you start to get more and more reports of infant deaths. And so this, I think, forces Israel's hand. As you mentioned, they're getting more and more pressure from European countries during this time. And by the way, during this span between early March, March 2nd, and the end of May, when no aid is entering Gaza, it's reported that 50 children die of malnutrition or deprivation during that time. And so, maybe they died of starvation, maybe they were, severely malnourished, like, literal skin and bones, and then they get like a flu or some kind of cold or diarrhea, and that just dehydrates dehydrates them to death, and they die of deprivation. So either way, absolute horrific ways for children to die. And of course, it's being directly caused by the Israeli blockade and siege of Gaza. And so I believe it's May 27th, Israel allows the GHF to open 4 sites in Gaza. Now, the plan is for the GHF to control these sites with private contractors, many of who are Americans. And then the IDF would have checkpoints along the way where they would screen the Palestinians. And so the GHF, either by ineptitude, which seems unlikely, or cruelty, which seems more likely, is not running these sites in the way that you would hope an aid distribution site would function. First of all, one of the things that aid agencies do when they distribute aid is that they try to build up enough aid that they could give everyone a portion. That way, you're not creating like fights over the food and things like that. You actually want to try to, flood the area with food so you don't create looting in dangerous situations, not only for the aid workers, but for the people attempting to get food. You have clear schedules, you made sure the aid distribution sites are near where the people are. And none of that is the case with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. The sites are remote. People had to travel long ways. They don't know when the sites are going to be open. There's a story in Al Jazeera of a Palestinian man in Gaza who explains that, people don't know when the sites are going to open. It's as early as 4 a.m. Sometimes people show up and they don't open at all. So people leave in the middle of the night and they walk to the aid distribution sites. And then on the way, they've been shot by the Israelis, at least 870 Palestinians. So we're now, probably 6 weeks after the GHF began operations in Gaza. 870 Palestinians have been killed at or on their way to these aid distribution sites. And so that's absolutely a horrific figure. But once they get to the sites, there's no systematic way to distribute it. They just lay it out. Then they allow the people in, and they'll say something like 4 minutes to collect as not much aid as possible. And the author describes a scene, something akin to the Hunger Games, where everybody is clawing and racing, knives come out, fights break out because you're talking about bringing food home for most people to their children. It's hot in Gaza. Things are absolutely miserable. I'm sure kids are crying all day long from hunger pains. And so getting just a little bit of food is going to make your life seem absolutely so much better. And if that's the case, obviously people are willing to resort to violence. And so I think it's very important to understand that not only is this meant to be dehumanizing, it's also meant to bring about the downfall of Palestinian society. To turn Palestinians against each other and make it like this game where people have to scrap and fight for little bits of food. But that's what the GHF is doing. Now the UN aid agency for Gaza, UNRWA, is saying even with the GHF operations, there's still such a severe shortage of food, especially like the food that children need, where adults it's a lot easier to survive off of just basic calories, but children really do need nutrition, vitamins, and things like that. And once children get malnourished, they can't just start eating rice and other food and expect that their body is going to respond well to it. They have these like very special malnutrition meals. Younger kids, I have a young daughter myself, they need formula. You can only feed them a limited amount of solid food. They need milk or breast milk. And of course, if the mother's starving, she's not producing breast milk at all. And so the children are going hungry, and this kind of aid isn't coming into Gaza. In fact, that's one of the really important things that the Freedom Flotilla Coalition is doing 3 times this year. They've tried to break the Israeli siege of Gaza, where private citizens will board private ships and try to sail it into Gaza and break the Israeli blockade of the strip. And these ships are loaded up with children's formula and other nourishing food for children. And the first ship was hit with an Israeli drone. The second ship is the one that had the climate activist, what's her name, Greta Thunberg, and then the third one now has just set sail. But these are all loaded up with formula, and this would be absolutely critical to bring into the strip. But of course, Israel is likely going to violently stop this aid ship from reaching the strip as well. And so while you had the situation where you have millions, literally millions of people on the verge of starvation, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of children actually in a state of severe malnutrition. You have literally thousands of trucks, maybe miles, maybe just a couple miles away from them, loaded with food. This crisis could be solved tomorrow if you let the aid trucks in, but Israel absolutely 100% is refusing to do it. It seems very clear that this is a part of the genocide, and that is something that Amnesty International has said, that the GHF is explicitly a tool of the Israeli genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza.
Yeah, and I mean throughout the whole war, Israel's prevented aid from coming in. They've closed crossings, then pressure gets put on them from various Western governments, and then they open it. And the argument at the time, they're not blocking it, and then they open one of the crossings to let it in. And then you had Israelis actually attacking aid trucks.
תראו, חבר'ה פה לא מפחדים, בחורות, בחורים, איזה יופי, עושים את המשאיות של החמאס, מקסימה.
It is a total outrage that there are people who are attacking and looting these convoys coming from Jordan, going to Gaza to deliver humanitarian assistance. We are looking at the tools that we have to respond to this, and we are also raising our concerns at the highest level of the Israeli government, and it's something that we make no bones about. This is completely and utterly unacceptable behavior.
Probably rogue Israelis rather than like the general population.
Well, I mean, you could say they're rogue, but the police are sitting there watching them do it. Then it is, kind of de facto being allowed by the state. I mean, this is kind of the situation in the West Bank right now, where you have a lot of the violence is not being carried out by the Israeli occupation forces, but rather these young radical settler movements that are going around and at times beating Palestinians, including Americans, to death. And the Israeli soldiers are just standing by and letting it happen. They're letting them burn down Palestinian homes. Not that the IDF isn't carrying out airstrikes and destroying places too, but it's important to note that they're allowing these extremists to run around and carry out violence under the watchful eye of the police.
Yeah, so I didn't mean from a state perspective. I agree. It's definitely in the West Bank. The army supports them or turns a blind eye, and same with these aid trucks as well. The police and people letting it happen. I meant more fringes in a civilian sense, like not the whole country of Israel's population might not agree of going that far more. Certain people are willing to travel out there and do that. And then obviously we had the pier that was set up under the Biden administration, which was gone.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and just mention that Israeli polling has showed that 80% of Israelis do support the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip. Now, I don't know if that means 80% of Israelis are willing to get their hands dirty and set the food on fire that's supposed to go to the little babies in Gaza, but it is a policy that is widely supported in Israel.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't disagree with that. And when you watch the Al Jazeera documentary, where basically Israelis kind of just documenting their own war crimes, and then kind of TikTok trends of people, under a tap of water and mocking them, that type of thing. There's definitely a lot of support there. Yeah, again, we had the pier that was created under the Biden administration, which was a disaster. Didn't make any sense because Israel was blocking aid from getting in, but then they're allowing them to build a pier so then they can bring aid in. It was just so stupid. Then you had like airdrops from the UK and the US where they were just dropping care packages of aid, but that's completely stopped as well. It seems they've just given up on that. And now we are where we're at. Just going back to the stories there of these shootings at these aid sites. So you mentioned a Palestinian reporting this. Just so people know, is there also confirmation, one on the Israeli government side or the IDF, and also I know there was that Haaretz piece where various soldiers and members of the aid group came out to speak about it themselves. It's not just Palestinians saying this, if I'm correct.
Oh yeah, yeah. I wanted to get that account from a Palestinian because that's what he's explaining what it's like to get aid from these distribution points. But yeah, the Israeli soldiers are admitting that this is happening. Several Israeli soldiers and officers spoke with Haaretz and explained that there's basically just a free for all shoot policy that at times are encouraged to fire on unarmed civilians, including with tanks and mortars and drones. And so, I think a lot of people would assume, and what the Israelis kind of put forward occasionally when the IDF does admit to the killings near the aid sites is they'll say, oh, a group of Palestinians approached too closely to our soldiers and they feared for their lives and so they shot, right? Which as, ooh, that person made me feel uncomfortable, so I killed them. That's obviously not a justification for murder, but I do think that's a scenario that when people hear it, they kind of are able to go, okay, I could see what's happening there. But when you find out that no, these 870 Palestinians, some of them have been killed in that fashion, but others have been fired on by a tank, right? How does a bunch of Palestinians standing around threaten a tank? It obviously doesn't. Some have been fired on with mortars or drones. And if you're far enough away to hit someone with a mortar or drone, obviously, once again, these people aren't direct threats to the Israeli military. All these people, there hasn't been a single time that they've been found to be armed or anything like that. And so there's no justification there. This is just open killing of civilians trying to get to aid sites. There's been contractors who have released video and said that they saw their fellow contractors seeming to murder civilians. There's been increasing videos of like the contractors kind of mocking the Palestinians, seemingly needlessly firing tear gas into the crowds, which of course, if you have large crowds of starving people and you're not effectively kind of set up to handle those crowds, you see what we saw in Gaza was it this week or last week, where 20 people were crushed to death, like that Astro World concert in the United States, or what happened in Korea during Halloween a few years ago, where people get so tightly packed, it's so hot, and then once in this situation, on top of firing tear gas into the crowd, people with breathing problems just very quickly can't get any oxygen and they drop dead. And so there's a lot of killings happening this way. It's also important to note that Abu Shabab, which is the name of a militant who runs a group called the Popular Forces in Gaza. And this is a group that has historical ties to ISIS in the Egyptian Sinai, which is a very dangerous organization. I know they don't get a lot of attention because I think almost all of their attacks are local, maybe more in Europe, because I do believe some of their attacks on like tourist buses and things like that over the years have killed some European, I think particularly French citizens. But they've done some pretty horrific things out in the Sinai and in rural Egypt as far as terrorist attack goes. I think they killed like 50 or 150 Sufi Muslims in a mosque a few years ago, just like open fire on the mosque. Absolutely horrific. So, this is a very nefarious group, and it's been embraced. It's been armed by Israel. And again, this is, I think, kind of has a two-pronged effect. One is the propaganda angle to be like, oh, we have some Palestinians on our side, and see, this isn't like an ethnic-based genocide or ethnic cleansing because you have some Palestinians carrying it out, but that you just have some real psychotic sons of bitches on the Palestinian side too isn't necessarily proof that this isn't a genocide or ethnic cleansing like the Israelis would like to tout it. I think the other thing is it kind of probably does have impacts on Palestinian society when not only is it the Israelis doing this to them, but their fellow Palestinians, because this group has looted aid trucks. It has killed Palestinians near the aid distribution sites, and it is fighting with Hamas. And so I'm sure they're causing a lot of problems, for the Palestinians.
Yeah, because this story broke out, and you thought there'd be maybe a lot of pushback. I mean, specifically Netanyahu has compared Hamas to ISIS and Al Qaeda, which is just crazy considering, uh, their support for those kind of groups during the Syrian war. Um,
Well,
But
and can I just mention the source for that story? That story broke from the former Israeli defense minister, who's a part of the right wing opposition to Benjamin Netanyahu. Lieberman was the one who initially said it, and Netanyahu's defense wasn't, "I swear to God, I'm not doing this. It's not happening," or citing national security, saying that we can't talk about this. He said it's saving the lives of Israeli soldiers. We got Palestinians killing Palestinians. What could be better than that? And that's kind of the Israeli perspective on this. From the Israeli perspective in the region, I think this is maybe a really important point, particularly from Benjamin Netanyahu. The groups that the United States would consider their enemies, Al Qaeda, ISIS, these international jihadist factions who have carried out either coordinated or inspired lone wolf attacks in the West, are Sunni jihadists. They are the faction of Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, or who now goes by Ahmed al-Shara, the president of Syria, who Israel, along with the United States, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, helped to put on the throne in Damascus and overrun Bashar al-Assad. And that was because Assad was allied with Iran and allowing Tehran to ship weapons to Hezbollah and Hezbollah was helping Syria and things like that. It wasn't just a one-way relationship. It wasn't just that Syria was being used by Iran. They were certainly benefiting a lot from that relationship. But just to point out that we've had this policy where we followed Israel around the Middle East and broken all of these states. Saddam Hussein, he was a Sunni leader, right? But he wasn't a bin Ladenite. And once he was dead, the bin Ladenites did run wild in Iraq for years and years and years. And then once that Al Qaeda faction ended up in Syria, they blew back into Iraq a few years later in the form of the Islamic State, or in Yemen, where we've gone against the Houthis and their main adversaries are Al Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula, or all of our interventions to break the state of Somalia, which has led to Al Shabaab, which I think, unlike ISIS and Al Qaeda and AQAP, probably shouldn't as much be, classified as an international terrorist organization. But they do say that they're allied with Al Qaeda, and they do hold territory in large part because of the U.S. legacy interventions in Somalia. So just to point out here that this isn't some unique policy of Israel's. They do prefer the Sunni evil to the Shia evil, as they would even say, across the Middle East. Even if from the American perspective, these are the people who do hate us, that actually do want to come to the United States and kill people, are these international Al Qaeda jihadists like al-Jawlani, Baghdadi, and others.
Well, Michael Warren, the Israeli ambassador
Yep.
to the US, actually said, we prefer the Sunni evil to the Shia evil. And it was literally just after, I think, ISIS killed like 1,700 Iraqi soldiers or civilians, something like that. He's like, well, we still kind of prefer.
And they were recruits too. They
Yeah.
were like recruits. They took them all out, lined them up, and shot them. I mean, this was at the peak of the Islamic State atrocities. You had I believe, former Israeli officials.
And what I'm going to say is harsh, and perhaps a little edgy. But if we have to choose the lesser of evils here, the lesser evil is the Sunnis over the Shiites. For the reason
You're
I
not
mentioned
speaking
before.
for me.
Okay, it's a lesser evil. It's an evil, believe me, it's a terrible evil. Again, they've just taken out 1,700 former Iraqi soldiers and shot them in a field. But who are they fighting against? They're fighting against the proxy with Iran that's complicit in the murder of 160,000 people in Syria. You can just do the math. And again, one side is armed with suicide bombers and rockets. The other side has access to military nuclear capabilities. So from Israel's perspective, if someone's got, if there's got to be an evil that's going to prevail, let the Sunni evil prevail. And I'm speaking entirely for myself.
People who were largely viewed in the United States to be speaking for Tel Aviv and allowing, in the world of the foreign policy establishment, oftentimes they're very open about how evil and cruel and backwards their policy is in a way they would never explain to the average citizen. So I think that was like at the Aspen Forum, which is where all these muckety mutts go to plot their next wars and things like that. And yeah, he was very open about that.
just going back to the aid group. So Israel's justification for using this particular group rather than going through the UN or other avenues is they say Hamas steals the aid, sells it on for more, keeps it for themselves. What do you make of any truth in that? Is there evidence of that, or there is a bit, but it's exaggerated? What's your
Yeah, so as far as Hamas stealing the aid goes, as far as I could tell, that's just simply untrue in the coordinated sense that people think, right? Where the aid convoy is moving through somewhere in Gaza, and a bunch of Hamas bandits come and they take over their trucks and they take it to their facilities to feed their fighters. I've seen media like Western media. I believe the Washington Post did a report on this and found that like they couldn't point any fingers at Hamas doing this. Additionally, and this is something that I find it's very difficult for people in the West to understand or even get their heads around. Hamas is not only a militant organization, it is also the government, or was at least the government of Gaza. So, as well as having the Al Qassam's brigade, Hamas also had a police force. And through a large portion of the Israeli onslaught in Gaza, that not large, I could probably the first year or so, the Hamas police were working with the aid organizations and escorting them to the aid distribution sites. This is important because if you think about it, you have a bunch of starving people and you have a truck full of food driving through town. Well, people are going to start jumping on that truck like it's a plane leaving the Kabul airport. Right? That is their life. That truck, that's the food that they need to survive. And so having the police force there to try to maintain order was highly important, except Israel bombed the police force and killed the Israeli police force to prevent them from doing this. And so rather than there being evidence of Hamas raiding and taking over these shipments, it seems to me that the opposite is true. Now, observers have pointed out that when people talk about Hamas or the Al Qassam's brigade, at this point, it's a very fragmented group. And so maybe some of the people who are Al Qassam's fighters aren't really in uniform right now, and they're effectively just a reservist, right? And they're with the rest of the civilians. And so does that mean that some of the food brought into Gaza doesn't, if a Hamas fighter, again, not somebody in fatigues and carrying a rifle, but just an adult male who is also a member of Hamas, have they gone up and gotten meals and receiving aid distribution? Probably throughout the conflict. Like there is some truth to that. Some of the aid that has come in has gone in the mouths of members of Hamas, but I don't think anybody wouldn't expect that, and that's clearly not what they're talking about when they're talking about Hamas stealing the aid, or at least that's not what Americans picture when Israel complains that we have to shut down the aid because Hamas is stealing it.
You think this aid group can continue the way it is? Because I mean, we mentioned before how European leaders were pressuring Israel to let more aid in. They now have set up this group and it's kind of gone a little bit quiet. They're still saying you need to do more, but there hasn't really been much kind of government announcements about, these killings that began. I haven't heard too many from the UK going, we condemn what's happening with like these killings of these aid. It's kind of just like, yeah, they're letting in aid now, and they're kind of ignoring that. I'll have to check after to make sure I haven't missed anything there. But do you think it can carry on the way it is? Is it enough for these governments just to go, well, look, now Israel is letting in aid, and when this happens, they go, well, Israel said Hamas, was involved, or the population, someone in who was going up had a gun, or yeah, as they have. Do you think it can continue, or is it just so in your face that it's gonna have to come to an end eventually?
Well, I guess 2 points here. One is I don't think the Europeans are putting up any serious resistance, but not to be insulting. You guys don't matter, right? The special relationship is between Tel Aviv and Washington, and even if the French and the British brought a resolution to the UN Security Council saying we're going to sanction Israel, the U.S. would veto it. It really does not matter. We're the bank account, and we're the daddy to Israel, and we get to protect them from the United Nations or any kind of real consequences. Israel, they have 7 million people, and they're one of the largest security dependents the United States has ever had. There's estimates that we paid for up to 70% of the ongoing wars that they have, and that's likely an undercount because it doesn't factor in all the billions of dollars in troop movements, these aircraft carrier strike groups going to the Middle East. It does include like waging war against the Houthis, but I'm sure we've spent a lot of money in the Middle East preparing for and moving troops around to avoid potential Iranian retaliations. They moved like all the aircraft out of the Al Udeid Air Base after Israel started their war. Well, that's expensive to do. These aircraft flight hours are not very cheap, and to remove that many aircraft and that many troops for a short period of time, only to move them back later, is just a very, very expensive operation. And probably putting a strain on like aircraft repair and maintenance that the Pentagon probably can't in reality handle. And so, this is a hugely expensive operation that only the United States is able and willing to finance. And so, I don't keep up too much about how much the Europeans complain about the Israelis, because I really don't think it matters. I know that the Spanish have floated the idea of revoking some of the European Union trade agreements with Tel Aviv. My guess is that Europe wanted to do this. The Trump administration would step in and start threatening tariffs and all kinds of other penalties on the Europeans to get them to capitulate. I mean, the world empire is now located in North America. It is in Washington, whether that's the Pentagon, the office of the AIPAC lobby, or the office of the President of the United States. The empire is located here, and only we could stop the Israelis. And I see no sign that Washington is prepared to do that. And so, that's kind of the first part of my answer. Now, the second thing is this is a part of the plan. So what the Israelis are trying to do, and this was laid out very clearly, very early on after October 7th, Ron Dermer explained that the other Arab states, the other countries in the region, won't take in the Palestinians. Now, he doesn't say why, and everybody assumes
Sorry,
the reason.
Can you explain who Ron Dermer is? Sorry.
Oh, yes, he's a top ally to Benjamin Netanyahu. He's the Israeli strategic affairs minister. He was born in Miami. James Corden on my show called him a traitor, and he's also a frequent guest at the White House. But I think probably right now he's been Netanyahu's longest running and most consistent ally. And so he's a very important figure in Israeli policy. And so right after October 7th, Ron Dermer acknowledged that the other Arab states won't take in the Palestinians. And people think that's because, these are Palestinians are either they're like dirty, they're bad, they're agitators, they're problematic, they embrace the Islamic State. These are all kind of accusations against the Palestinians. Now, when people say, they're agitators, I think this is maybe somewhat true, that the Palestinians, would like to live in a state where there's a democracy, right? And that they have rights. And so they're shipped off to Egypt, where there's a military dictator, or Jordan, where there's a king, or Syria, where you have a jihadist president. Yeah, the Palestinians may agitate against that. That's not necessarily a knock on them or a character flaw, but I think that the main thought is that they're maybe like the Americans view the Mexicans. They bring crime. They're poor, so they require welfare. They're not going to get jobs. They're just going to add problems to your country. But that's not it. The reason that they don't want to take in the Palestinians is because the rest of the Arab people, maybe not al-Sisi, maybe not King Abdallah, maybe not Jolani, but the people of Syria, the people of Jordan, the people of Egypt would rise up and say, you are helping a genocide take place. The Palestinians do not want to leave. And by opening your doors to them, you're giving Israel the international permission they need to conduct this ethnic cleansing. You cannot be a part of it, and we will rise up and overthrow your ass and treat you just like the Libyans treated Gaddafi if you move forward with this. And that's why these governments have been so opposed to this. But Dermer said, if you make life in Gaza hard enough, if you make conditions bad enough, that one day these governments will see it as an act of humanitarianism to take part in this ethnic cleansing. When the choice is, watching every single one of your children, one by one by one, drop dead of starvation. All of your male relatives, one by one, picked off by sniper fire, by tanks, by drones. I mean, Israel has these little drones now flying, like, just, the types of drones that people buy at Hobby Lobby, not the expensive ones, not the cheap ones, right? And they have those drones, and they're carrying grenades, and they're just dropping them on people, right? This is a horrific life, a horrific existence. And Israel and Dermer believe that if Israel can make conditions in Gaza horrific enough, that the other countries would take in the Palestinians. And so now this was going on under Biden, seems to be stepped up under Trump, that we're going to countries, and not countries that are maybe well off and have a lot of money, like the Saudis, like the Qataris, like the Emiratis, and maybe talking about having them import the Palestinians as migrant workers. Although I would imagine that that would maybe be the more sensible plan to take, but no, they seem to be taking and isolating.
So there you were just talking about the governments, the US and Israel were looking to speak to about bringing in the Palestinians, and you was about to discuss how they've gone to certain governments that are quite unstable and war-torn. So if you could just carry on that point.
Right. And so rather than going to those countries, they're going to Syria, where you have Abu Mohammed al-Jawlani, an international terrorist whose face just 6 months ago was on wanted posters, a $10 million bounty, 8 figures. This man is so dangerous. Don't you think that if he takes in 200-300 Palestinians and gets international recognition, he might see that as a pretty good deal? Or if you go to Somalia, where you have the government in Mogadishu, who is, fighting off what could be a regime change by, Al-Shabaab is really threatening Mogadishu right now. And the Trump administration has carried out like 50 airstrikes in support of the Mogadishu government. And I think there's good evidence that had they not done that, Al-Shabaab would have made real gains against the government in Mogadishu. And so maybe they take in a few 100,000 Palestinians to keep the U.S. military aid coming. Then you also have Puntland and Somaliland in Somalia, independent regions. Maybe they take some Palestinians in exchange for international recognition. And then we've also know they've approached Sudan, where you have a brutal civil war going on. And I think their plan there seems to be talking to the Sudanese military and not the Rapid Response Forces, the RSF, which, I guess they're probably taking the wider hats of the two very, very dark hats in that conflict. But still, talking about giving them the military support they need, giving them cover for the war crimes they've committed, and not having to face, any international challenges for that, being welcomed in as a part of the U.S. empire. I think that's something that we're offering to the Sudanese. And Sudan's a major country. I mean, we can maybe offload 500,000, 750,000 Palestinians there without upsetting the balance of situation too much. And then Libya, where they've talked to both government, the one led by Haftar and the one which is based in Benghazi, and also the one based in Tripoli. I mean, this is a country where the Tripoli government is desperate. There's been fighting in the streets of Tripoli over the past couple of months. Or Haftar, maybe he decides that with a little bit of U.S. military support, he could finally win the civil war once and for all, and maybe reconstitute the Libyan state under his control. And so if you look at all these governments, suddenly you very quickly are able to get to, maybe 1.5, 2 million Palestinians that you're able to ship all these people off to without the U.S. empire giving up a whole lot. And so I think that is the play here, to make the conditions so horrific, to give the governments of all these countries kind of room to sell it to their people as a humanitarian act, and then also bribing them behind the scenes.
That's definitely a point to hammer home from earlier, where people go, well, look at these other Arab countries, they don't want to take the Palestinians, no one wants them, there must be something inherently wrong with them. Rather than, if you're Saudi Arabia and you bring in all the Palestinians, you've just aided and abetted Israel, and then you're stuck with all of them to deal with. It's not like you just bring in everyone in America and the UK and Europe at the moment are really up in arms about the immigration policies of just letting in people. And then you just go to some country, why don't you want to let in 2 million people and aid and abet, potentially your enemy? Like it just makes no sense. Why would you, want to get involved in that? And they know ultimately that's what Israel wants. Israel wants them to go. So when people are like, why don't we just have voluntary migration? That's exactly what Israel wants. And it's not very voluntary because you destroyed the whole place. And there is, genuine question of can the Palestinians live there because it is so destroyed. We obviously saw when the ceasefire did go on that all the Palestinians did walk back to the destroyed areas in Gaza, and then they're still committed to staying there. So there's a question of would the Palestinians even leave if you had these governments offer to take them in? Um,
Yeah,
but I mean,
that's another really important part of all of it that I didn't even touch on is what happens if the Palestinians plant their feet
yeah,
and say, we are not going. Although I do think the solution there for the Israelis is just to keep killing them.
yeah. I mean, I think it's quite hard to argue that they're not using starvation as a weapon. I mean, they have pretty much the whole war. Like, although this particular point in the war with this aid group and the killings that have been happening and reported is more in your face. I mean, from day one, they said, they're going to stop everything, the electricity, and throughout they've carried out that. They haven't let NA, as we spoke about earlier. So the policy's just become a bit more murky and a bit more dodgy with these kind of private contractors. Just moving on from Gaza to the West Bank. So we've had, actually, sorry, before we move on to the West Bank, it could be a good story to move into it. So I think there was recently just a bombing, if I'm correct, of is it the Catholic Church in Gaza that literally just was reported. Have you looked into that at all? Was it in Gaza? Was it in Gaza City? Is that correct?
No, I guess a couple things. I right before this, I was actually working on an article about the Iranian nuclear facility, so I didn't get a chance to look at it, and I'm very sorry about this. I just got a message from my daughter's daycare that I have to go pick her up because she's not feeling well. So I'm happy to reschedule sometime in the future or something like that. But I could probably do one more question, then I gotta roll out of here.
That's okay. I mean, if you need to go, that's absolutely fine. We can finish on Gaza, and then next time we can talk about the West Bank and Syria or Iran if you want. But no, if you need to go get your daughter, no worries. We pretty much
I
finished with Gaza.
appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Hope she feels better.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great talking to you again. I always really like coming on your show because I feel like I give good interviews to you, man. So
Yeah, no, you
I thank
definitely
you for
do.
having me on.
Definitely do. Yeah, speak soon. Have a nice day and go get your daughter.
All right, thank you. Bye.
See you later, mate.